This week, Oda decided to draw Doflamingo, showcasing a hint of kindness to a chick that has fallen off the nest. And I happen to think that this cover makes a really good combo with the cover page for chapter 860, which shows Crocodile holding an umbrella for a pug so that it no longer gets wet. So we have both of these ex-Shichibukai characters who were presented to us as unredeemable villains during their respective arcs, showcasing kindness to animals. And there's a lot of structural and thematic similarities between Alabasta and Dressrosa as arcs. And so even though this is just a fan request, it would not surprise me if later down the road, Oda decides to expand on Doflamingo a little bit more as a character and showcase more of his possibly redeeming qualities. Now, with each passing week, and especially with these last couple of chapters, it seems to me that Oda has been getting closer and closer to revealing something pretty important about Devil Fruit powers. Now, whether that's what a Logia awakening actually looks like and does, or whether that's how all three types of Devil Fruits are intrinsically connected, and at one point back in history when Devil Fruits were first invented, maybe they were one and the same, that remains to be seen. But given what we saw happen in Hashinosu and given what we see happening here in the Reverie, I definitely think that this is leading up to a big reveal. I mean, for crying out loud, Oda even used the Devil Fruit pattern, the Devil Fruit swirls or spirals, as background to the panel that features the Holy Knights or the God's Knights. And so because Spandam at one point said that the reason why he was able to get Kaku and Khalifa's Devil Fruits was because he was well connected within the government, that actually got me thinking that perhaps the Holy Knights are the keepers or the protectors of the main source or tree that produces Devil Fruits for the world government. Now, as some of you have already noted, the Holy Knights were first mentioned during a Marine meeting in chapter 1054. And so based off of what was mentioned back then, it made it seem as if the Holy Knights were responsible for resolving disputes that involved the Tenryubito. But then also, given what Dragon says, it seems as if they can also leave Marijoa to act as enforcers for the government. With that in mind, though, it does kind of bring up a question, which is why did the Holy Knights not get involved here when all this chaos was going on? I mean, I just feel like fighting off revolutionaries that are invading their home turf would be part of the Holy Knights' job description / duties. It's interesting that we get what appears to be like 9 new silhouettes in this, and apparently they decided to just leave everything up to the admirals. Unless, of course, it was the case that none of the knights were there in Marijoa to begin with. Or maybe the government is just super adamant about handling these knights with a lot of secrecy. So unless it's a pretty serious deal, like them losing resources, or kingdoms rebelling against them, or Flame Emperor Sabo's revolution, they don't actually allow the knights to be public about who they are or reveal their identities. Then again, a group of revolutionaries infiltrating Marijoa and them burning down the symbol that represents the celestial dragons seems like a pretty major incident to me. But then Dragon also mentions that the Holy Knights need to be mobilized, which to me kind of implies that they need to receive orders from somewhere to do stuff. And so maybe this can work to explain why it is that Dragon has been laying low all this time and hasn't really taken part in any of the action. Because I remember after Dressrosa, we found out that the Blackbeard pirates invaded Baltigo, and so a lot of fans were saying, how come Dragon and the revolutionaries didn't do anything against Blackbeard? So I would argue that the reason for that is because, just like in Mihawk's case, fighting the Yonko is not part of Dragon's priorities. Defeating the Yonko is not one of Dragon's objectives. He doesn't want to take them down. In fact, I'm not even sure if he considers them targets, because Luffy is one of them. But that aside, what he really wants is to be able to stop the Celestial Dragons from ruling the world. That is his priority. That is his main goal, his main objective, which is why he says the fighting will start once the Holy Knights get involved. So maybe that's what he's been waiting for all this time. Also, I like how Ivankov highlights the importance of the food theme in the story, which is something that I discussed last week about how Luffy tells Kaido that he wants to create a world where his friends can eat as much as they want. In this chapter, Ivankov says that the Celestial Dragons have no defense against the lack of food. So we see this theme being repeated in the series over and over again. Sanji's flashback, also Kaido's flashback, when we learned that back when he was younger, even though he was super strong, even back then, he would get hungry and he would allow himself to be caught by the Marines because the Marines would feed him. So how valuable is it to be that powerful and strong if you don't have anything to eat and are starving? We go back in time over a month ago, which to us in real time, these events were actually happening 4 years ago. And the way this chapter ends makes it obvious that this is just part 1 of the flashback, because by the end of the chapter, Cobra's still alive. Not only that, but there are still other plot points that need to be checked off. For example, we know that Bonnie needs to be able to escape here and make her way to Egghead. We know that Wapol has to intervene here at some point, and that him and Vivi end up in the same place under Morgan's care. So how does that happen? Also, Sabo has to free Kuma from Charlos and his father as well. In addition, post-Reverie, Fujitora has to end up with some bandages. So whether those wounds are caused by the crow attack that we see from Karasu here remains to be seen. And speaking of Karasu, it is revealed that his double fruit is not a Zoan type. His crows aren't even crows to begin with. They are formations of soot. And the way his body reacts to being shot at is typically the way that we've seen Logia types react. And so given that soot is something that can naturally occur in nature, I definitely think that this power can be classified as a Logia. I mean, something needs to burn in order for there to be soot, so in that sense it would be similar to Smoker's fruit, which is also a Logia. And so again, this is why I think that Oda's getting ready to reveal something pretty big about double fruits, because he's been hinting at the fact that there are some double fruits that blur the lines between types. We saw this with Luffy and Wano, and how Kaido was mentioning that Luffy's double fruit seems to have properties of both a Paramecia awakening and a Zoan awakening at the same time. We also saw this recently with Prince Groose as well, where he's able to manipulate Clay as if he were a Paramecia user, yet at the same time, his power extends to being able to create golems that have bodies that appear to have Logia properties to them. So he can create these sentient beings out of clay, which aligns with what Karasu is able to do with his crows, because these crows, they seem to have some degree of intelligence. They've been used for reconnaissance. We've seen them deliver news to people. They're actually strong enough to where they can actually carry people around like Sabo. Plus, as we see in this chapter, and as we've seen before, Karasu can use these crows to communicate, to speak to people long distance. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen a Logia user mold their element to create animals. Specifically, when it comes to the admirals, we've seen Kuzan use Pheasant Beak, which generates a giant pheasant figure out of his ice. We've also seen Sakazuki use Houndblaze, which creates a dog out of his magma. And so I'm wondering if these examples might be scratching at the surface of what a Logia awakening might be revealed to be, or if they're just supposed to be interpreted as very creative techniques that a double for user can sometimes come up with because they think outside the box in terms of how to use their power. And thinking about it a little bit more, Cracker's not a Logia, he's a Paramecia, but I think we could argue that his biscuit soldiers could kind of fall under the same umbrella as Karasu's crows and Prince Groose's golems. So with that in mind, I think it'd be awesome if we could see Kizaru create an army of monkeys made out of light, all of whom carry their own little light sword. I also like the pun of Karasu's attack called Obelisuts, because the spears kind of look like obelisks. Now, as we had already been told from chapter 1054, both Fujitora and Green Bull are both being forced to hold back during this altercation. In fact, we actually see Broccoli Man get threatened by being told by a celestial dragon that if he messes up, he's going to get executed. Now, the truth of the matter is that whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing for the admirals, because I've seen this comment be interpreted both ways, no matter how you slice it, if you were to rank all of the admirals just based off of experience and time in the Marines alone, you would come to the conclusion very quickly. If you were being honest, you would very soon realize that both Fujitora and Green Bull would be at the bottom of that ranking. Like, I don't think it would be a controversial thing to say that Fujitora and Green Bull technically are the weakest admirals. Akainu became fleet admiral after his fight against Kuzan, and Kuzan was actually trained by Garp. It's also been heavily implied that Kizaru has trained under Sengoku. And so with Kuzan gone, based off of seniority, and based on the fact that we've seen Kizaru constantly have talks with Akainu, we can infer that he's higher up the admiral ladder than Fujitora and Green Bull, who were drafted during the 2-year time skip. So again, we have the 2 weakest admirals being nerfed versus the revolutionaries being successful with their mission. What credible take can we take away from that? Now, given that we already know that Sabo will be framed for King Cobra's assassination, I'm guessing that the keys to the collars that he's looking for have to be near the area where King Cobra will be meeting with the Gorosei. Now, if it turns out that King Cobra was in fact killed by one of the Gorosei, I think that would be a cool way of giving us a hint, or at least giving us a snapshot of how it is that the Gorosei fight, just to get a quick glimpse of their power before we see J. Garcia Saturn do something in the present. We also get a panel of Shirahoshi speaking to someone that she's holding on her palm, and I don't know if that's supposed to be Garp or not, but whoever it is, the fact that the person is obscured might mean that this person is about to play a role in this flashback very soon. Because it seems like St. Charlos is still set on getting his hands on the Mermaid Princess, and he's out for revenge for being publicly embarrassed. Additionally, Vivi is already near the gondola elevator, meaning that she's getting ready to leave, but she's also refusing to be escorted by Rob Lucci. But the thing is that it seems that she's there by herself with him, and we know that Vivi goes missing around the same time that her father gets killed. So I'm guessing this might be the point where Wapol shows up and reluctantly helps Vivi escape. I'm not sure if Pell and Chaka will be able to make it to Vivi in time, but if they do, it'd be kind of cool to see a 2v1 Zoan fight, Leopard Lucci versus a Jackal and a Falcon. And I know that Rob Lucci has Zoan Awakening under his belt, but remember, Pell is Oppenheimer level. He is Nuke level plus. Oh, and speaking of former CP9 members, I'm pretty sure that this is the first time that we see kind of like the gang back together again post time skip. They all dress in white now, and they all look pretty much the same except for Cha-pa-pa-pa. He ended up going to the store and picking up some pretty cool round shades. Was it ever explained why his mouth was a zipper? And just a quick note, I find it interesting that we don't get to see either Pell or Shaka's actual faces in the chapter. The panel kind of cuts them off right here. So I'm wondering if those people could actually be like spies or people that have already taken Pell and Chaka's place and are about to stab King Cobra in the back or something. Because I do find it interesting that we don't get to see their faces. Okay, now it's time to address/explain one of the theories that has been gaining a lot of traction this week, and that is the Shanks has an evil twin that is part of the Holy Knights theory. Okay, so if we look at the silhouette provided to us in this chapter of the Holy Knight that resembles Shanks, and we look at the weapon, we look at the sword, the silhouette of the sword doesn't seem to match Griffin's outline very well. Because Griffin's hilt has a curve structure that kind of pierces the handle, the main handle, and a part of it comes out the other side. And we don't see that here with this person's silhouette, so the sword is different, which is fine because we're not saying that this person is Shanks, we're saying that this is somebody that looks a lot like Shanks. Now, if Shanks actually does turn out to have a twin brother that turns out to be a Holy Knight, that actually could serve to explain some things, like how there are moments where Shanks can get from one place to another very quickly. For example, when he arrived in Marineford and people were surprised that he arrived there so soon because he was reportedly also seen intercepting Kaido very recently. After Whole Cake Island, he's in the middle of nowhere reading a newspaper, and then a few chapters later, we see him getting an audience with the Gorosei. Now, what's interesting about that scene is that he's fully covered in cloak, so we can't really even see if he's missing an arm or not. And then a Reddit user by the name of Tuss Taster actually compared some panels of Shanks being drawn from the side, and the user noticed that the man who gets an audience with the Gorosei doesn't seem to have a scar. Additionally, this goes without saying, but it would make a lot of sense if this guy is a Holy Knight, that he would just be able to walk up to the Gorosei room and have an audience with them, even during Reverie. Another thing, and this was something that was pointed out by Greg in one of his official columns. For those of you who don't know, Greg is known as Oshimusa108 on Twitter. So Greg wrote a column, and in it, he pointed out that he found something strange in chapter 1076, which is the chapter where we see Shanks and his crew hanging out with the Giants of Elbaf in a bar. And as pointed out by Greg, in that scene, Oda decided to draw Shanks along with some blueberries right next to him. And the reason why that's strange is because according to Shanks' Reverie card, the food that Shanks likes the least, his least favorite food, are blueberries. So why are there some giant blueberries there on the table right next to him if he hates them so much? Unless, of course, the blueberries are actually the least favorite food of somebody else that looks exactly like Shanks, somebody that could perhaps pass as Shanks if the opportunity presented itself, and as he's done in the past, maybe Oda will revise the Reverie card in the actual manga and say, oh no, we made a mistake. The Reverie card was actually referring to Shanks' evil twin's preferences when it comes to food. This also really wouldn't be the first time where Oda decides to introduce some twin shenanigans going on in One Piece. And Egghead as an arc has actually brought cloning to the forefront in the story as well, with the Seraphims, as well as with the connection between Bakans and Stussy, and possibly Weevil and Whitebeard. I'll leave the link to the column in the description in case you want to read it. It's originally in Japanese, but you can translate it into English with your browser. The analysis then goes into looking at the root of the word blueberry, specifically in French. So I thought that was interesting because we also know that Pangaea Castle, which is the castle that we see in Marijois, where we see the Gorosei, that castle is based off of a French castle in real life that is called Chateau de Chambord. And so the French word for blueberry is myrtille, which actually comes from the name of a character in Greek mythology called Myrtilus, who, by the way, happened to be the son of Hermes. And so what's interesting about this character being the son of Hermes in Greek mythology is that Hermes in Roman mythology was known as Mercury. And so that would align very well with the bit of speculation that states that each of the Gorosei is named after a planet. Additionally, the column brings up the theme of betrayal as being a big part of Myrtilus' story, which if you look into it, you'll find that the story involves betrayal regarding a marriage and also regarding a chariot race. But as it relates to Shanks in One Piece, the question is, which one of the brothers was actually the betrayer? Because there are several canonical hints that point towards Shanks in his early days being part of the world nobles. But then he lost that status because he became a pirate. And thanks to Film Red, we know that Roger and Rayleigh found little Shanks inside of a treasure chest, probably after the events of God's Valley. And we know that God's Valley, that's where some of the Tenryubito would hang out. And so now I'm thinking that maybe both Shanks and his brother were there in God's Valley, and that's where they got separated. Additionally, in Film Red, we also learned the name of a secret family, or a family that might be connected to Shanks' bloodline, because we hear one of the Gorosei mention the name of the family, and that name is the Figarland family. And the reason this gets brought up in the movie in the first place via the Gorosei is because it's implied that there is a connection between Uta, Shanks, and the Figarland family. And so if we look at those two characters, right, if we look at Uta, we look at Shanks, what do those two characters have in common? Red hair, right? The red hair. Now I want to go back to chapter 1076 because in that chapter there's a bit of dialogue from Shanks that, according to Sandman, the Japanese fans just picked up on it and started analyzing it immediately. And so that bit of dialogue is when Shanks says, "I think I spent a bit too much time talking, but you can't blame us for wanting to catch up when old friends who thought each other dead are reunited." And so if we take that comment as being directed to both Dory and Bragi, which seems to be the case, that is a very weird thing to say. Because what he's saying is that the Giants believed that Shanks was dead. Why would the Giants believe that? Shanks is a Yonko. Like, he's known worldwide as an emperor, as one of the 4 emperors. Like, he's in the news. He has one of the highest bounties to his name. He stopped the Marineford War. And so maybe you might be tempted to argue that the Giants don't get the news. But they do. They actually do. We actually have a cover page in Little Garden with Dory and Bragi and some newspapers flying around. And so maybe you can say that maybe Shanks wasn't talking about Dory and Bragi. Maybe he was referring to Oimo and Kashi, who are the 2 giants that were fooled into working at Enies Lobby. The problem with that, though, is that Oimo and Kashi left Enies Lobby 2 years ago. Plus, we also saw them in Water 7, which is where we saw the Straw Hats get their bounty raised. The main point here being that the Giants have access to the news. So if they have access to the news, and given that Shanks is a famous figure, he's a Yonko, right? The world knows about the Yonko. If they saw a picture of Shanks in the news, why wouldn't they think, hey, Shanks is alive? The only way that makes sense is if they saw that picture of Shanks, if they see the newspapers talking about Shanks, and they're like, yeah, this guy is somebody else. So maybe they thought that the very famous person featured in the newspapers was actually Shanks's twin. Which means that the Giants know about Shanks' family history, which explains the title of the chapter 1076 called Old Friends. So again, the only way that it makes sense for the Giants to have read the newspaper, which we know they do, we know they read the newspaper, and still think and still believe that Shanks was dead is because they thought that the newspaper was lying and that there was somebody else that looks exactly like Shanks that was passing as Shanks. And given the silhouette that we see here in this chapter, that is very much well hinted at. So there you have it, guys. Shanks has an evil twin fan theory explained. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought about the points that I raised down below in the comments section. Take care, have a great week, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.